Hello, my name is Diana Barton, and our state presidency has asked that I record a presentation that I gave for our stake leadership meeting last Sunday via Zoom. The topic was emotional wellness and specifically anxiety. So hopefully you'll find that there are some things in here, some concepts and some tools that will be helpful for you in your everyday life and even long-term throughout your relationships and within your family. So let's begin by talking about emotional wellness. What does that mean to you? A lot of times people think that if I'm emotionally well, that means that I'm stable, I'm joyful, and that things don't really seem to throw me too much in life. But actually, being emotionally well is a lot more than just handling stress. It involves being attentive to your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors, whether they're positive or negative. It's like a meme that I saw not too long ago that I thought was perfect. It said, stress is like a pulse. If you have it, you're alive. And I thought, okay, yeah, that is accurate. That's very accurate. Whether we realize it or not, anxiety in and of itself, though, is it's harmless. And stress is something that we deal with every single day. And we oftentimes think that the anxiety that goes hand in hand with that stress is just completely negative. But it's actually, in some regards, it can just be harmless. But it's our resistance or our reaction to it that causes problems. So let's just take a look for just a second at anxiety and stress. Let's look at some definitions. So stress and anxiety 101. All right, stress. Stress is just a response to a threat in a situation. Anxiety, on the other hand, is a secondary response. It is a reaction to the stress. So stress is created in our mind through our thoughts. It is something that we experience because of our perceptions of an event, or our perceptions of something that someone said, or perception of something that someone did. So it's not like an event is happening at us or to us. It's our perception about the event and how it affects us that causes the stress. Our brains are problem solvers, and they want to be able to figure things out. And as incredible as they are, they function, the main function of our brain is actually to keep us safe and to keep us alive. And so oftentimes when we feel high levels of stress, then anxiety comes into play. And that's where that secondary response comes as a reaction to that stress. Now, what is the difference between everyday stress, everyday anxiety, and perhaps disordered anxiety? Because there is a difference. So we all get what everyday stress is, happens to us every day because we are alive. Everyday anxiety, much the same. But for just a second, this disordered anxiety, let's address that. So disordered anxiety is something that creates a dysfunction in individuals. It's where they can't go about their everyday life. It's where it's debilitating. And if you find that you're in that place where you've crossed the line from everyday stress and anxiety to the type of anxiety that makes it so that you're not feeling safe in a normal, safe situation, or if you feel like anxiety is preventing you from going about life in a normal way or a natural way, then that's something that you will probably want to consider getting some professional help for. Now, for our intents and purposes today, we're going to talk about the types of stress and anxiety that are not clinical. They are not completely debilitating, because that is something that is very personal, and you'll need to work with a therapist or a good counselor, and oftentimes even medication is helpful in trying to deal with those things. So let me ask you this, back to kind of everyday stress and anxiety. And right now I think a lot of people are feeling that those even just everyday stress and anxiety are off the charts. People have different responses to anxiety, and there are many factors that actually contribute to that. Physiologically, we're different. We have biological factors, our hormones and our chemicals within our bodies are different, and sometimes there are imbalances that throw things off. Our diet makes a difference. Whether or not we get enough sleep or rest makes a difference. I know for me that when I am not well rested, or if I am sleep deprived, I'm very anxious, and I have a really hard time dealing with sometimes just the everyday stresses that come, and that anxiety that's hand in hand with that. So my husband and I laugh. I think some of the worst advice that I was ever given when I first got married was, don't ever go to bed angry or upset with one another. Well, for me, that's not good advice. I need a good night's rest, and then you will have a much more reasonable conversation with me in the morning, and it won't seem 10 times whatever it is that I'm upset about as bad in the morning. So it will come down a lot. So that's some advice that I had to learn, what works well for me and what doesn't. So take some advice that works for you and leave the rest. But everybody's different. Everyone has different life experiences as well. And oftentimes that shapes our perceptions of the world, of other people, and of just other life experiences that we run into. Okay, so emotions. Anxiety is definitely an emotion. And it's good to know that anxiety and other emotions, they're just vibrations within the body. If we were to, try and describe what anxiety feels like to you, chances are you would probably say that it might feel like tightness or pressure, heat, rushing, or even nausea. There are a lot of different ways that different people experience anxiety, but those are some key ways that are very consistent across the board. Well, good news, we know more about emotions ever than before. Because of brain imaging, we understand how the brain functions better than we did in the past. And so we really don't have to be uncomfortable with anxiety if we can be aware of it and know how to better manage it. So here are a few things that we want to kind of be aware of as we proceed through this. Anxiety has become kind of a buzzword today. It's just something that we use. Oftentimes you'll hear the younger generation a lot saying, oh, I have anxiety, and so it's an excuse not to function properly or to avoid certain situations. But oftentimes we mislabel other emotions that we're having as anxiety, and we're just using anxiety as kind of an umbrella term, but we're not really identifying what that core emotion is that we're feeling. There's also something called the Bader-Meinhof phenomenon, or frequency bias. Perhaps you've heard of those terms before. But a good example of this is, have you ever learned a new word, and then all of a sudden that word, you start hearing it over and over again where you'd never really noticed it before? Well, that's that frequency bias. And oftentimes the same thing happens with anxiety, where the mind, and the brain, it looks for certain things if we're thinking often about them. And so if we look for ways which we're going to be anxious, or if we look for triggers, then our mind will see them more frequently. The other thing that is important to be aware of, and this kind of goes back to the whole buzzword thing, is that, like I had mentioned before, where we have a fairly limited emotion vocabulary. When I've done presentations to youth in the past, I show a slide that has just tons of emojis on it, and I say, I bet you could do a better job of pointing out what emotion you're feeling using these emojis than probably verbalizing it. And I think a lot of us, not just youth, are that way. Sometimes it's easier to just say, okay, yeah, that's how I'm feeling, but not really verbally get it out or process through it. So Those are things that are good to be aware of. Now, like I said, we often label our emotions as anxiety. And I really like using something called an emotions wheel. And in the core of this emotions wheel, we see 7 emotions that most often those are the emotions that people identify as having the majority of the time. And so the way you use this emotions wheel can be very useful. So if you look in the center of that, for instance, let's find sad. Can you see the sad in there? The blue triangle in the center. Well, if I'm feeling sad, say I'm a 16-year-old and I'm feeling sad and I can't really figure out why, so I look at this emotions wheel and I go through to that next level and I think, okay, why is it that I'm sad? Oh, I'm feeling lonely. Okay, let's see, so what's making me feel lonely? Then I go out to the next outer section of that wheel, and I see those 2 subcategories of lonely, and I see the word abandoned. And I think, okay, that's it. That nails it. I am feeling abandoned, which is why I'm feeling lonely, or which is I'm feeling sad because my friends ditched me Saturday night. So that is a great tool to use to help better identify our emotions when sometimes we're not even quite sure why we're feeling off or why we're feeling a certain way that we do. But it's important to also remember that anxiety oftentimes will happen when we have a primary emotion, one of those maybe negative emotions in the center of that wheel, and we try and resist it. We try and avoid it. And so as a result, that's when anxiety comes into play. When we learn how to allow those primary emotions to play out and to be able to feel them, and we practice feeling those emotions, and we get good at allowing them, then that helps take out that secondary emotion, or at least bring that secondary emotion of anxiety down within that equation. It's really interesting. Sometimes people feel embarrassed or ashamed when they struggle. I love this quote. These afflictions are some of the realities of mortal life, and there should be no more shame in acknowledging them than acknowledging a battle with high blood pressure or the sudden appearance of a malignant tumor. So let me ask you this. Why is it that we often feel embarrassed or ashamed when we have something we're struggling with? If for some reason your eyesight wasn't as good as it used to be, I don't think that most of us would struggle to go to an ophthalmologist and have an eye exam done and get a pair of prescription glasses to help us see. Well, mental and emotional challenges really are no different. There is a really interesting term called affective forecasting, and it's a trick that our brain often plays on us. And often we use our present feelings as a starting point when we attempt to predict our future feelings. We expect the future to feel more like our present than it actually will. And there are times when individuals might be struggling with suicidal ideations, like what they're experiencing is never going to end. And unfortunately, individuals that have suicidal thoughts, they don't want to die. They just don't ever foresee that pain going away because of that affective forecasting. So if we can look for those individuals that we feel are struggling, or if we can ourselves, if we are struggling, not be embarrassed and know that there is help out there, and know that it isn't always going to be the way we are or feeling in the moment, then that provides hope and healing and starts that process of being able to pull out of that really dark place that people can oftentimes find themselves. It's really important to also acknowledge that it's okay not to be okay. But what is not okay is not to reach out and ask for help or to accept the help if it is offered. A lot of times people feel like asking for help makes them feel like a failure or a project. But if it hasn't happened to you yet in your life, I promise that it will. There will come a time when you will say, I'm not okay. And that doesn't mean anything's wrong with you. It means that you are a spiritual being having a mortal experience. And there are times when you're going to run into obstacles and challenges that might seem insurmountable. But know that it's okay not to be okay. There is a LDS life coach, and she's a certified life coach, and her name is Jody Moore, and she has a great quote that just nails it on the head. She said, "People, life is supposed to be messy. If it's supposed to go perfect like that, then it's going wrong for all of us. And then that's really scary, and the brain wants to be anxious. Nothing's really gone wrong if it's supposed to be difficult and messy. It's meant to have contrast. That means half the time things are going how we want, or maybe even better, and they're going to be amazing and fun and joy-filled, and then half the time they're going to be disappointing and hard and frustrating and sad and worried. And when you make peace with the idea that life is supposed to be hard, then it takes the secondary emotion of anxiety out of the equation. You can still feel all the other emotions that a mortal life experience offers, but you can avoid the anxiety that often goes along with it. So, yes, there needs to be opposition in all things. And in the absence of opposites, all things tend to be in a state of oneness, a compounded one, and therefore without opposition there would be no need for agency or even for the atonement. So it's part of this beautiful plan of happiness. When we look at things with this perspective, like life is supposed to have contrast, then we're better able to say, this is all happening for me, instead of this is happening to me. And that's what's called a growth mindset. We are better able to allow experiences to move through us, and it provides an opportunity for us to really see miracles that we wouldn't have otherwise seen in our life had we not gone through those difficult experiences. Well, let's talk about a few concepts and coping skills that I think you will find helpful. The first one is you can cultivate and change your emotions. You think it, you feel it, you do it. Those are three very important words when it comes to understanding and really accepting that you can cultivate and change your emotions. Everything you feel and everything you do begins with as a thought. And what you choose to think about your circumstances affects your emotions. Okay, the second one is self-awareness and mindfulness. Now, if you are self-aware or in a state where you are mindful of situations, then what you're able to do is you're able to avoid ruminating on these things over and over in your head. A good example of this is, have you ever traveled from point A to point B? You leave from point A and you arrive at your destination at point B and you don't really remember the drive in between. Well, that happens quite often. It's because our minds aren't where our bodies are. And if our minds are where our bodies are, then we are noticing our environment. We're feeling perhaps the sun on our face. We are smelling the smells of maybe blossoms on the trees. We are experiencing life, and we're not allowing those things to control us, and we feel like we have a better hold on and can process through these emotions in a more healthy fashion. Now, the third coping skill that we're going to be talking about today is the acronym HALTS. HALTS. H stands for hungry, A, angry, L, lonely, T, tired, or S, getting sick. So if you're ever feeling off, overly stressed or overly anxious, or just like something's not quite right, and I do this all the time, I will sit down for a moment, I'll say, okay, am I hungry? When was the last time I ate? Am I feeling angry about something? Am I lonely? Because there are times when I can be in a room full of a lot of people but still feel lonely. And so I have to sit down and process through, why is it I'm feeling lonely? Am I tired? Oh gosh, do I need to say no to a few things and back off on my schedule and maybe try and readjust because I'm just exhausted? Or am I getting sick? And oftentimes we can't do anything about getting sick because it's already happening, but there are things we can do to perhaps manage the symptoms. And so that's a very useful acronym, HALTS, that I use all the time. And then now the very last one is very simple, but it is very effective, and that is deep breathing. When you breathe in deeply, what it does is it helps to oxygenate your system again, and then also it helps to calm your nerves and to reduce the levels of cortisol and also reduce the levels of adrenaline that you have surging when you're experiencing high stress and anxiety. I never really realized what a poor breather I was until I got an Apple Watch. And every now and again that thing will vibrate on my wrist and I'll look at it and it'll tell me to breathe. And I don't realize it, but I have been apparently taking these little short breaths, which are part of the fight or flight response that our brains have us go into, because our brains are on default. They're there to keep us alive, to keep us from danger. And even though we don't live in a day and age where we're being chased by saber-toothed tigers, there are other things that we find threatening. And as a result, our brains try and problem solve, sometimes for things that haven't even happened yet, and it doesn't have enough information to problem solve. And so it becomes anxious, and we feel a greater amount of stress, and then it's just a vicious cycle. So if we can take a moment to take some nice deep breaths down, all the way down to our belly, and then when we exhale all the breath out. Those are some beautiful, easy ways to really just power down and kind of, as I tell my kids, get a grip sometimes. We used to say that all the time. Fortunately, I don't have to say it quite as much anymore, but it's myself that I'm telling me now to get a grip. So life can be really interesting, and I think that we're finding right now, these are some very challenging times with COVID-19, for instance. These are very uncertain times, and bottom line, it's really hard. And I don't think that one thing that makes it an interesting time is it's not just hard for us individually, but it's hard for us collectively, for the whole world. And this is uncharted territory for most of us. But I do believe that there are things that we can learn from this. And that if we are struggling, don't be afraid, be courageous and share your experiences, because there is a lot of healing that can happen when we are vulnerable and when we share with one another. I think it also helps others to feel like they can share as well, and they might not have the courage to share unless you are the one to first express your emotions and your feelings. So I challenge you to be vulnerable, and I challenge you to be courageous and to share at this time, because this is a very difficult time in life, and I do believe that we have the power to pull together, and that when we put things in perspective in that way, that's where growth happens. In conclusion, I want you to know that I know that the atoning love of the Savior includes his willingness to bear our day-to-day stress and anxieties and fears, as well as the burdens of our sins, all of which deprive us of peace and joy. And I bear my witness that when we use our gift of agency and we recognize and control our thoughts and emotions, we can experience the joy spoken of by Lehi, that God shall consecrate our afflictions for our gain. Of these things I bear witness in the name of our Savior Jesus Christ. Amen.